I'm Paul Mould. I'm a Christian writer, and I usually write about revival, particularly topics to do with revivals that have been forgotten down the generations. So my interest in revival really started as quite a young Christian. I'd only been a Christian probably about 15 years or so, when there was a move of the Spirit, which was typically called the Toronto Blessing. That was 1994. And it had such a deep impact on both myself and my wife that we realised that this was something from God and something we really wanted to try and take hold of and move forward with in the rest of our Christian lives. So it wasn't actually until rather later on that I read a bit more about revivals and realised that the Toronto Blessing had many of the characteristics of a typical revival. Some people called it a renewal, but even in revivals, a large part of what God does is to renew the church and to enliven Christians and get them excited about Jesus and sharing the good news about Jesus. So for me, I really had that great interest about revival from that point forward, and I read what I could about revival. We have to sort of skip forward a number of years until about 2016, when the leader of the church we were in at that time, he stood on the platform, so this was in Manchester, where I currently live, and said that someone had told him there's never been a revival in Manchester. So I was a bit offended by that. I thought, surely at some point in history God must have moved in Manchester. But no one had really seemed to have written anything about it, so I couldn't really give an answer at that time as to whether there had been or had not been a revival in Manchester. It was only kind of when I retired a few years later that I started to look into it with more seriousness and found a very useful website called ukwells.org, which described pretty much every place in the UK that had ever had a revival. And I found some entries from Manchester on there. So I thought immediately, well, it does look as though something's happened in Manchester. So this time was the 1859 revival, which again most people have probably never heard of, but was actually the greatest revival that England has ever seen. It had a profound impact in Northern Ireland, where there were 100,000 converted in the space of about 6 months. Went then to Scotland and Wales and finally over to England. Now in England it wasn't such a dramatic event as in Northern Ireland. It was more sort of powerful but extended, shall we say, over a few years. But nevertheless, there were about 650,000 people converted in England over the period of 1859 to about 1863 or 65. So it was the greatest revival we've actually seen on English shores. So I started to write a bit about revival in Manchester. In 2021, I published my first revival book, which was Revival in Manchester, 1859 to 1874. That also included a period a bit later where Moody and Sankey, the famous American evangelists. D.L. Moody was famous, probably the greatest evangelist of the 19th century. Sankey was a very powerful singer of gospel songs. And they had a very powerful impact in England and also Scotland. So that period was also included in my book, my first book about revival. So what happened subsequently was I was starting to learn about the work of the Salvation Army, and I began to see that from a period of about 1878 onwards, another work of revival was going on in the country that was sort of centered on the Salvation Army. So I wrote my first book about the Salvation Army in 2023, which was called Birthed in Revival Fire. So that was about the beginnings of the Salvation Army. But at that time I also discovered that there must have been another powerful move of the Spirit in the period about 1884 to 85, because it was kind of mentioned in a biography of one of the early Salvation Army pioneers, whose name was Elijah Cadman, that there was a sudden increase in revival phenomena around the time 1884, where there were many healings and other works of the Spirit. Particularly, he mentions what the Salvation Army called glory fits, which were times where the Holy Spirit would knock people to the floor and became almost unconscious, but they had a real experience of the Holy Spirit and a vision of heaven. And generally this lasted for a few hours, after which people recovered. So after writing a couple of other books, this book, A Wave of Glory, was a book that describes that time. So to write this book, I actually had to make a couple of visits down to the Salvation Army Heritage Centre in London and spend some time there and get all the information that I needed. So that took quite a bit of extra work to get all the information together. But when I started, I didn't know whether the time that was recorded, which was this 1884 to 85, I would find evidence of that in the Salvation Army magazine, which was called The War Cry. Until recently it was also called The War Cry. So this is reports from throughout the country detailing what was going on in the different places. And I was finding that throughout the country, and especially in England, there was a great work of the Holy Spirit going on. And they would often describe these times when the Holy Spirit was moving so powerfully as a time when waves of power, or waves of glory, or indeed a wave of glory, came into the meeting that they were in. Many lives were changed, many people were saved. So that really is the story of A Wave of Glory, and I really consider it probably my most important book. It's certainly one that describes a lot of miracles and healings with the signs and wonders that I've not read about elsewhere. And I think it's really important that people should have that information about what God was doing in that period. It really was a special, powerful period of revival. So my aim for the book is pretty much like all my books on revival. I want it to inspire people to seek God for another revival. I want them to be renewed as they read the book, that they will have a Holy Spirit encounter for themselves, and really, well, as you read about revival, I think you're inspired to press into God, seek God for another revival, share about that revival, encourage other people to get interested in seeking God. So I see it as a way to encourage the church, to refresh and renew the church, and also to help us to stay on the road seeking God for revival, and have that encouragement that God can do it again. So that's the thing I'd really like to see come from this book, and indeed all my books about revival. Well, my first knowledge about the Good News Bookshop in Loughborough was, I think I heard, must have seen something through an email. I think that was probably where I found out about the Good News Bookshop. Interestingly enough, my roots are in Leicestershire. My mother came from Haddon, and my father came from Melton Mowbray, and I was actually born in Melton Mowbray. So knowing that Leicestershire was kind of placed dear to my heart, I thought, I should make sure my book gets in a bookshop in Loughborough, because my brother actually still lives in Shepshed, so it seemed to me that I should definitely have my books in the Good News Bookshop. And obviously, I know it covers the whole country, but Loughborough is still a place that's important to me.